The door slammed with the violence of a gunshot, rattling the windows and shaking the foundation of everything I thought I knew about love. The sound still echoes in my chest 22 years later, a hollow drumbeat that pounds against my ribs whenever I close my eyes. That was the sound of my childhood dying. That was the sound of my father's voice cutting through me like broken glass. From today, you are no longer part of this family. Get out. You've brought shame to us all. My name is Rachel, I'm 37 years old. And that was the moment my own father spat me out of his life because I was pregnant at 15. The suitcase hit the porch with a dull thud, my entire life crammed into that battered leather case that used to belong to my grandmother. Everything I owned, everything I was, reduced to one pathetic bag sitting on the concrete like roadkill. The October wind cut through my thin jacket, and I could hear my mother crying behind that closed door, soft, broken sobs that seeped through the wood and wrapped around my throat like a noose. But she said nothing. Not one goddamn word. She let him throw me away like garbage, and all she gave me was the sound of her tears, as if that was supposed to be enough. As if that was supposed to matter when the only home I'd ever known was being ripped away from me. The porch light flickered once, then went dark. Even the house was turning its back on me. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in the United Kingdom, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in Australia, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The streets at night are different when you have nowhere to go. Every shadow becomes a threat. Every sound makes your heart hammer against your chest like it's trying to escape. I walked for hours that first night, my suitcase wheels scraping against the asphalt, leaving scars on the pavement that matched the ones being carved into my soul. The suburban streets I'd grown up on suddenly felt foreign, hostile. House after house with warm yellow lights glowing in the windows, families eating dinner together, parents tucking children into bed. All the things I would never have again. Mrs. Henderson saw me through her kitchen window as I passed. Our eyes met for a split second, and I saw the judgment there, the disgust. She turned away and pulled her curtains shut. That's when I knew the news had already spread through our small town like wildfire. Rachel Morrison, the good girl gone bad. The pastor's granddaughter who fell from grace. The cautionary tale mothers would whisper to their daughters. I found shelter that first night in an abandoned bus stop on the edge of town. The metal bench was cold against my back, and the wind howled through the broken plexiglass like the screams I was holding inside. My stomach cramped from hunger, but more than that, it cramped from the tiny life growing inside me, the reason for my exile, the reason I was now nothing more than a stranger sleeping rough on the streets where I used to ride my bicycle. The smell of damp concrete and rotting leaves filled my nostrils, mixing with the sour scent of my own fear sweat. I pressed my face against the cold metal of the bench and tried to remember what it felt like to be safe, to be wanted, to be loved. But those memories felt like stories someone else had told me about a girl who used to exist. By morning, my clothes were soaked through with dew and my joints ached like an old woman's. But the real pain came when I had to go to school, had to face the stares and whispers that followed me down every hallway like hungry ghosts. That's the girl who ruined her family's name, they hissed behind my back. That's the one who threw her life away. My friends, the girls I'd shared secrets with, laughed with, dreamed with, they crossed to the other side of the hall when they saw me coming. Their mothers had warned them. I was contagious now, a disease they couldn't risk catching. The isolation was worse than the hunger. It was worse than sleeping on benches and washing in gas station bathrooms. It was the knowledge that I had become invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a life I could no longer be part of. The guidance counselor called me into her office once, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she talked about alternative options and difficult circumstances. But I saw the way she looked at me, like I was already dead, already gone, already nothing. Would you have survived if your own parents threw you out like that? Be honest, drop it in the comments. And if you're watching this and still haven't subscribed, tell me why. Because stories like mine aren't told anywhere else. 21 years later, I stood in my dress blues in the gleaming hallway of the Naval Air Station, the gold of my lieutenant commander insignia catching the fluorescent light. The uniform fit like armor, every crease precise, every button polished to mirror brightness. My son Matthew stood beside me, 21 years old and taller than me now, his own military bearing straight and proud. He was everything I had fought for, everything I had built from the ashes of that broken 15-year-old girl. The legal papers in my hand felt heavier than they should have, the official letterhead swimming before my eyes as I read the words again and again, trying to make sense of something that defied all logic and decency. A custody petition. A grandfather's rights claim. After 21 years of silence, after 2 decades of pretending I didn't exist, my father was suing for access to the grandson he had never met. But it wasn't love driving this sudden interest in family. The private investigator's report made that crystal clear. My grandfather, my father's father, had died 6 months earlier, and his will contained a provision that tied a substantial inheritance to Matthew's bloodline. Suddenly, the grandson who had been born in shame was worth something. Suddenly, the baby who had cost me everything was valuable enough to fight for. The same father who had called me worthless, who had thrown me out like trash, who had let me starve in bus stops and sleep in doorways, was now demanding access to my son. Not because he loved him. Not because he wanted to make amends. But because Matthew's existence could unlock millions of dollars in family money. The hypocrisy burned in my throat like acid. The sheer fucking audacity of it made my hands shake as I folded the papers and slipped them into my jacket pocket. He wanted to see his grandson? He wanted to play the loving grandfather? After what he had done to me. After how he had destroyed everything I was and forced me to rebuild myself from nothing. Imagine being abandoned, then suddenly demanded back because of money. Would you forgive? Comment yes or no. And if you're watching silently without subscribing, why stay quiet when the truth is burning right in front of you? I didn't answer the first phone call. Or the second. Or the 15th. My father's voice on the answering machine grew increasingly desperate with each message, the commanding tone I remembered from childhood cracking and breaking like ice in spring. Rachel, please. We need to talk. This is about family. Family. The word tasted like poison in the air of my spotless apartment, where the walls were covered with my commendations and Matthew's achievements, where every photograph told the story of a life built without them. The emails came next, flooding my inbox like a digital tsunami. Formal at first, then pleading, then angry, then pleading again. My father had hired lawyers, investigators, anyone who could help him track down the daughter he had discarded like yesterday's newspaper. They found my address, my phone number, my workplace. They found everything except the way back to the girl who had once loved him unconditionally. Then came the ambush. I was leaving the base after a particularly brutal day of training exercises when I saw him waiting by my car. 21 years had not been kind to Richard Morrison. The man who had once seemed like a giant to my child's eyes was smaller now, his shoulders stooped, his hair thin and gray. The authority that had once terrified me had withered into something pathetic and desperate. He looked like exactly what he was, an old man who had made a terrible mistake and was finally beginning to understand the cost. But I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no recognition of the father he had once been. He was a stranger wearing a familiar face, and I walked past him like he was invisible. The same way he had made me invisible all those years ago. Rachel. His voice cracked like a teenager's. Please, just 5 minutes. I kept walking. My heels clicked against the asphalt with military precision, each step carrying me further away from the past he represented. I could hear him following, his breath labored, his pleas growing more frantic. But I had learned the power of silence in those dark years after he threw me away. I had learned that sometimes the cruelest thing you can do to someone is give them exactly what they once gave you, nothing. My lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana Walsh, smiled when I told her about the encounter. Good, she said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. Let him sweat. Let him beg. Silence is power, Rachel. Use it. I thought about my Navy mentor's words as I sat in my study that night, writing in the journal I had kept since those first terrible days on the streets. The same silence they gave me as a child, I now return as an adult, I wrote, my pen moving across the page with the same precision I brought to everything else in my carefully constructed life. They taught me to disappear. Now I'm simply applying the lesson. If you've ever dreamed of justice that doesn't require shouting, just silence, hit subscribe right now. And if you won't, at least explain in the comments, what keeps you from standing with truth? The invitation came on expensive stationery, my father's carefully scripted handwriting spelling out words that must have burned his throat to write. Please come to dinner. Let's talk things over. As family. The paper felt foreign in my hands, like a relic from an archaeological dig, something left behind by a civilization I no longer belonged to. I stared at myself in the mirror as I put on my dress uniform that evening, every ribbon and medal a testament to the life I had built without them. The woman looking back at me bore no resemblance to the broken 15-year-old who had once begged for their love. This woman was steel and fire, forged in abandonment and tempered by rejection. This woman owed them nothing. Matthew stood beside me in his own uniform. He had followed me into the Navy, another choice that proved how completely we had built our lives outside their sphere. Are you sure about this, Mom? He asked, his voice carrying the same strength that had gotten us through countless obstacles. I'm sure, I said, adjusting his collar with hands that didn't shake. They want to meet their grandson? Fine. Let them meet him. Let them see exactly what they threw away. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the imposing facade of my childhood reduced to just another suburban colonial with peeling paint and an overgrown garden. The same house where I had taken my first steps, said my first words, dreamed my first dreams. The same house where those dreams had died on a cold October night. The door opened before we could knock, my father's aged face crumpling at the sight of us. Behind him, my mother hovered like a ghost, her hair white now, her eyes the same pale blue I remembered, but filled with something that might have been regret. The dining room table was set with the good china, the crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier that had hung there since I was a child. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, broken only by the soft clink of glasses and the whisper of cloth napkins. I sat across from the parents who had given me life and then tried to take it away, my son beside me like living proof that their abandonment had not destroyed me. We were untouchable now, unreachable, existing in a sphere they could never enter again. At this point, would you have even walked into that house? Or would you have left them begging? Drop your choice in the comments. My father cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the oppressive quiet of the dining room that had once been the scene of family dinners and homework sessions and birthday celebrations. Now it felt like a courtroom, and I was both judge and jury. Rachel, he began, his voice carefully modulated, rehearsed. I want you to know that what happened before, it was all a misunderstanding. We were young, we were scared, we didn't know how to handle. No. The word cut through his speech like a blade, sharp and final. It was not a misunderstanding. You didn't lose me, you threw me away. You made a choice. You chose your reputation over your daughter. You chose your standing in the community over your child. You chose everything else over me. His face went white, the carefully prepared speech dying on his lips. My mother's hand fluttered to her throat, that familiar gesture I remembered from childhood when she was nervous or afraid. But I felt no sympathy for their discomfort. They had forfeited the right to my compassion the night they put my suitcase on the porch. And now, I continued, my voice carrying the authority of 2 decades in the military, the steel that had been forged in the fires they had lit. You want my son? Not because you love him. Not because you want to be grandparents. But because he represents money to you. Because his bloodline can unlock an inheritance. You don't want family, you want access to wealth. The silence that followed was deafening. My father's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, and my mother's tears began to fall, the same useless tears she had cried the night they destroyed our family. "I built everything you see on the ruins you left behind," I said, each word measured and deliberate. "I became an officer, a leader, a mother, a woman who serves her country with honor. I did all of that without you. Despite you. Because of what you taught me about survival and strength and the price of depending on people who call themselves family but act like strangers." I stood then, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with finality. Matthew rose beside me, his movements synchronized with mine like we were performing a military drill. We were a unit, a team, a family of two that had never needed anyone else. "You disowned me once," I said, my voice carrying across the space between us like a death sentence. "Don't dare claim me now." We walked toward the door, our footsteps echoing in the house that had once been my home and was now just another building full of strangers. Behind us, I could hear my father's voice calling my name, pleading, begging, but the sound seemed to come from very far away, like an echo from a life I had lived in another century. This is where I turned my back on them. Would you have done the same or stayed? Comment below. And if you can watch this far without subscribing, why? The lawsuit that followed was a masterpiece of legal incompetence and public humiliation. My father's lawyers, expensive suits with Harvard degrees and mahogany offices, had apparently never encountered a case where greed was quite so nakedly obvious. The court documents, which became public record, painted a picture so clear and damning that even the most charitable observer couldn't miss the hypocrisy. Man abandons pregnant teenage daughter, then 21 years later sues for grandparental rights when an inheritance is at stake. The local newspapers picked up the story first, then the regional ones, then the national legal journals. My father, who had once been so concerned about his reputation, watched that reputation crumble under the weight of his own avarice. The family estate, which had been the source of his sudden interest in Matthew, became tied up in court proceedings that would drag on for years. His other children, my siblings, who had watched silently as he destroyed our family, began choosing sides. Some supported him out of fear or greed. Others quietly reached out to me through intermediaries, expressing regret and shame for their silence all those years ago. The house where we had eaten that final dinner together went up for sale 6 months later. The neighbors who had once whispered about my teenage pregnancy now whispered about something else, the mighty patriarch brought down by the daughter he abandoned. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. Meanwhile, my career continued its upward trajectory. The Navy, an institution that valued honor and integrity above all else, recognized those qualities in me. I received a promotion to commander, was selected for a prestigious assignment at the Pentagon, became the kind of leader who inspired loyalty through example rather than fear. Matthew graduated from the Naval Academy with honors, his future bright and limitless. We built a life of purpose and meaning while theirs collapsed under the weight of their own choices. I didn't have to destroy them. They did that themselves the moment they decided money was more important than family. Justice doesn't always roar, it sometimes whispers. If you believe this ending was deserved, subscribe. And if not, comment why. I want to hear your heart. The courtroom was everything I had expected. High ceilings, dark wood, the smell of old books and older disappointments. I sat in the witness stand in my dress uniform, the gold on my collar catching the light as I answered the judge's questions with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years learning to communicate clearly under pressure. My father's lawyer, a man whose desperation was beginning to show around the edges of his expensive suit, tried to paint me as vindictive, as someone who was using my son to punish her parents for past mistakes. He spoke about forgiveness and second chances and the importance of family connections. But the judge, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much human foolishness to be impressed by flowery rhetoric, asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter: Counselor, where was your client when this young woman was 15? Pregnant and homeless? Where was his concern for family then? The silence that followed was answer enough. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my words simple and direct. Your Honor, I don't need revenge. Their downfall is their own doing. I'm not here to punish them. I'm here to protect my son from people who have demonstrated that they view children as commodities rather than human beings. They had their chance to be family. They chose not to take it. The judge's verdict was swift and decisive. No standing, no rights, no access. The man who had once held absolute authority over my life was powerless in the face of the law and his own documented cruelty. The gavel came down with the same finality as that door slamming 22 years earlier, but this time, I was on the winning side. I walked out of that courthouse into blazing sunshine, the heat on my face feeling like absolution. Matthew walked beside me, his hand briefly touching my shoulder in a gesture of support and love that said everything words couldn't. We had faced down the ghosts of my past and emerged victorious, not through violence or vengeance, but through the simple power of living well and refusing to be broken. Behind us, the courthouse doors swung shut on a chapter of my life that had taken decades to close. Ahead of us stretched a future bright with possibility, unburdened by the weight of people who had never deserved the title of family. They called me a stranger. And now, finally, I am one by choice. I am a stranger to their greed, their hypocrisy, their selective love that appears and disappears based on convenience and profit. I am a stranger to the world where children are disposable and forgiveness is demanded without earning. I am a stranger to the people who gave me life but never gave me love. And in being their stranger, I found my freedom. The girl who once slept in bus stops became a woman who commands respect from everyone who serves under her. The teenager who was thrown away like garbage became a mother who raised a son with honor and integrity. The daughter who is deemed worthless became a leader who proves her worth every single day. They wanted me to disappear, and I did, but not in the way they intended. I disappeared from their sphere of influence, their ability to hurt me, their power over my happiness. I created a new life, a better life, a life that stands as a monument to the power of human resilience and the possibility of rising from ashes. The sun was warm on my face as we walked toward our car, toward our life, toward our future. In the distance, I could see my parents standing on the courthouse steps, looking older and smaller and more lost than I had ever seen them. For just a moment, I felt something that might have been pity. But then Matthew said something that made me laugh, and the moment passed, carried away on the wind like smoke from a fire that had finally burned itself out. What would you have done if you were in my place? Drop it in the comments. And remember, if you can sit through this entire story and not subscribe, at least tell me why. Because silence strengthens lies, but your voice changes everything. The stranger in sunlight walked away from her past and into her future, whole and unbroken and finally completely free.